everyone. We have learned from our previous discussions that the blood is made up of cells. And cells, as living matters, will meet its end someday. And unlike nerve cells, blood cells have shorter lifespan. So how does the body replenish its supply of blood cells? That is through hematopoiesis. And that will be our topic for today. At the end of our discussions, we should be able to first define hematopoiesis. Next, differentiate the types of hematopoiesis, describe the stem cells, explain the events occurring in the periods of hematopoiesis, discuss the organs involved in adult hematopoiesis, compare stem cell and cell production theories, and describe the morphologic changes that occur during cell maturation. Hematopoiesis refers to the continuous and regulated process of blood cell production. Now, in hematopoiesis, we will not only focus on the number of cells or the number of blood cells produced. We will also focus on the differentiation and the development undergone by the different blood cells for them to become mature or functional. So, unsa ganini ang differentiation? So when we talk about differentiation, it refers to the processes undergone by the cell in order for it to become differentiated or in order for it to become distinct from the other cell types. So differentiation is somehow related to maturation because as a cell matures, the cell will develop properties or any characteristics that will make it different from other cell types. So when we discuss hematopoiesis, we have to know first the cell that started it all. So that cell is the hematopoietic stem cell. So hematopoietic stem cell is the origin of all the blood cells present in our circulation. So hematopoietic stem cell is the foundation of the adult hematopoietic system because sa hematopoietic stem cell gikan ang ato ang RBC, WBC ug mga platelets. So, how nagikan sa isa ka hematopoietic stem cell nahimo siyang RBC, WBC or platelet? We'll find that out later. For now, let us differentiate the types of hematopoiesis according to the synchronicity of the nuclear and cytoplasmic maturation or kung unsa ba kapag kasabay or kung nagsabay ba ang nuclear ug cytoplasmic maturation because as the cell matures, it is also understood that the cytoplasm and the nucleus should mature. The first type of hematopoiesis according to synchronicity of nuclear and cytoplasmic maturation is the synchronous hematopoiesis. So very understandable no, synchronous hematopoiesis is the type of hematopoiesis wherein the nucleus and the cytoplasm of the cells of the hematopoietic cells develop together at the same rate. So this is the physiological, this is the normal hematopoiesis. Kay normally dapat man jud gud magsabay si nucleus ug si cytoplasm in maturation or in maturing. Now the other type is the asynchronous hematopoiesis. In asynchronous hematopoiesis, mo ni siya ang pathological. So sa asynchronous, very understandable, dili sabay ang nucleus ug ang cytoplasm in the maturation process. Na ay ubang diseases na si cytoplasm ang nagalag or ang behind sa maturation, napoy ubang cases or ubang diseases na si nucleus ang lagging or ang delayed ang maturation. One example of a disease that causes asynchronous hematopoiesis is the iron deficiency anemia. So in iron deficiency anemia, the cytoplasm of the cell or the cytoplasm of the RBC delays or is delayed in maturation. Just a vague idea as to why delayed ang cytoplasmic maturation sa RBC sa mga patients nga na IDA is that sa iron deficiency anemia, of course, deficient ang iron. And iron is an important component of the hemoglobin. And si hemoglobin is an important component of the cytoplasm. Okay, hindi siya masakto. So if baba ang iron, baba ang hemoglobin, therefore maglisod og mature ang ato ang cytoplasm. Thus, in IDA, the cytoplasmic maturation of RBCs are delayed. Another example of a disease that will cause asynchronous hematopoiesis is the megaloblastic anemia. So in megaloblastic anemia, the nuclear maturation lags or the nuclear maturation is delayed. Why is that so? So general lang po no or summarized view lang sa pathophysiology sa megaloblastic anemia. In megaloblastic anemia, there is deficiency of vitamin B12. Napoy ubang cases na baba si vitamin B9. So these two vitamins are needed for the nuclear maturation of cells in the bone marrow. Therefore, if wala ni silang duha ka vitamins, delayed ang nuclear maturation. So again, synchronous hematopoiesis means that the nucleus and the cytoplasm developed or matured at the same rate. So sabay nag-develop ug nag-mature si nucleus and cytoplasm. Synchronous hematopoiesis is the hematopoiesis present in normal individuals or in healthy individuals, whereas asynchronous hematopoiesis means that either one of the nucleus or the cytoplasm is lagging or is behind in maturation, and asynchronous hematopoiesis is pathological. So asynchronous hematopoiesis is only present in those people nga naay hematological diseases. The next category wherein we can categorize or differentiate hematopoiesis is according to the location. So there are two types of hematopoiesis according to location. First is the medullary hematopoiesis. Next is the extramedullary hematopoiesis. So medullary hematopoiesis refers to the hematopoiesis which occurs in the bone marrow, whereas extramedullary hematopoiesis refers to the blood production or to the hematopoiesis that occurs outside the bone marrow. Extramedullary hematopoiesis is not normal in adults. However, at some point in our life, naay time na si extramedullary hematopoiesis ang ato ang primary means or primary type of hematopoiesis. But in adults, the primary type gyud of hematopoiesis is the medullary hematopoiesis. Now let's proceed to the different types of human stem cells. We have the totipotential stem cells, pluripotential stem cells, and multipotential stem cells. The totipotential stem cells is the youngest of the three stem cells. So, as the youngest, pareha sa to katong bata pa kayo, we can be anyone we want to be. Mao po na si totipotential stem cells. Totipotential stem cells is the most versatile of these three stem cells. So, si kani siya nga stem cells appears few hours after fertilization. Remember that after fertilization, the fertilized egg will undergo several cell divisions. So, in every division aning atong illustration nga pangit kaayo, kay isa na siya ka cell. So, isa na ka cell, kani one cell ni, one cell. Now, these cells are the totipotential stem cells because they can be anything they want to be. Some of these cells will become the placenta. Some of these cells will become the yolk sac. Some of these cells will become the embryo, and so on. So basically, kani sila nga mga cell can become either the embryo or katong gawas sa embryo. So the next type of stem cell is the pluripotential stem cell. So these pluripotential stem cells are derived from totipotential stem cells. Si pluripotential stem cells, they are present several days after fertilization. So our fertilized egg, several days after fertilization, will somehow look like this. So this is the embryo. Then this is the yolk sac. So si embryo no kay mao ni ang human. Soon to be human. Meanwhile, ang yolk sac, mao na siya ang murag primary supporting system ni embryo. Dinhi siya nagakuha og mga nutrients temporarily until pag mahurot na ang yolk sac, si embryo kay mag-rely or mag-depend na lang gyud siya pirmi sa mother. Okay, so much for that. Asa si pluripotential stem cells dinhi Pluripotential stem cells are located in the embryo. That is why pluripotential stem cells are also termed as embryonic stem cells. Unlike totipotential stem cells na very versatile, no? They can be anything they want to be. Si totipotential stem cells, pwede siya maging kani embryo, pwede siya maging kani yolk sac. Si pluripotential stem cells, ang kaya lang niya maging, or ang iyang capacity lang, is to become whatever organ it is present in the embryo. So, nakita ninyo ang pag-reduce sa capacity sa stem cells. So, the next type of stem cells are the multipotential stem cells. Multipotential stem cells are derived from pluripotential stem cells. So, if si pluripotential is the embryonic stem cell, because it can be any organ na naa sa embryo, si multipotential stem cells is the tissue-specific stem cells. That is because it can be any cell present in that specific tissue. Now, it is safe to say that hematopoietic stem cells can be classified as multipotential stem cells because they are limited to become only blood cells. So, the hematopoietic stem cells, it can only become WBC, RBC, or platelet. Let's now proceed to the hematopoietic developmental periods. So, in this part of the discussion, we will discuss how did hematopoiesis evolve from embryo to fetus to adult. So, we have 3 hematopoietic periods. First, the mesoblastic period, the hepatic period, and the medullary or the myeloid period. So, the first period is the mesoblastic period. So, in this hematopoietic period, no definite hematopoiesis happens. So, murag dili in ana, or ang hematopoiesis nga nahitabo sa mesoblastic period is not the same as the hematopoiesis that happens sa ato karon as adults. So, mesoblastic period of hematopoiesis begins 19 days after fertilization and up to the 8th or 12th week of gestation. So, mesoblastic period of hematopoiesis happens in the blood islands of the yolk sac. So, since it happens in the blood islands of the yolk sac, it is considered to be an intravascular and an extra-embryonic hematopoiesis. So, ma'am, asa na yung ginayaw-yaw? 19 days after fertilization, we all look like this. So, ores ng inyong throwback picture, inyong baby picture, kay na ako'y embryonic picture. So, at the 19th day of our mother's gestation, pareha tatanan og naong, and it is like this. So, this is the embryo, the developing embryo. And this is the yolk sac. So, within this lining, within this cavity, within this area, happens the mesoblastic hematopoiesis. The area of the yolk sac surrounded by angioblasts are termed or is termed as the blood island or the blood island of the yolk sac. So, what are angioblasts pala? Angioblasts spelled as ANGIOBLAST. These are the cells that will in the future become blood vessels. So, it is safe to say na ang blood island of the erythrocyte of the yolk sac, the blood island of the yolk sac is lined with angioblasts or is lined with primitive blood vessels. So, the hematopoiesis that happens during the mesoblastic period is defined or is classified as intravascular and extraembryonic. Why? Because the process of the production of the primitive erythroblast happens within these blood vessels. Kaya diba, lined with primitive erythroblast man ni ang blood island. Lined with primitive blood vessels man ni ang blood island. Now, within those blood vessels, sa sulod dito sa blood vessels, happens the production of the primitive erythroblast. Thus, intravascular ang hematopoiesis. Kaya naaman sa sulod sa blood vessel na hitabo ang hematopoiesis. At the same time, it is extra-embryonic because remember, this is the yolk sac and this is the embryo. So, sa gawas sa embryo, nahitabo ang hematopoiesis, therefore, extra-embryonic. The hematopoiesis that happens during the mesoblastic period is not a definitive hematopoiesis. That is because, di ba, ang product sa hematopoiesis during the mesoblastic period are primitive erythroblasts. Now, these primitive erythroblasts are not the same with the erythrocytes na ginaproduce nato karon currently. Those primitive erythroblasts will not persist throughout life. So ang mga primitive erythroblasts limited lang gyud ang ilahang existence during the mesoblastic period. Aside from that, lahi pod ang primitive erythroblast sa mga erythrocytes natong gina-produce karon because lahi sila og origin. Primitive erythroblast originated from the mesenchymal cells lining the yolk sac, whereas the current erythrocytes that we as adults now produce are originated from the aorta gonad mesonephros region of the embryo. So mauni sila no. These stem cells or the stem cells or ang origin sa hematopoietic stem cells na nagahimo sa ato ang current blood cells. Please do note that these stem cells are CD34 positive. So mao na siya ang cell marker sa ato ang mga hematopoietic stem cell, ang CD34. Another difference of the primitive erythroblasts with the current erythrocytes na ginaproduce nato karon is that lahi ang iyahang gina-contain nga hemoglobin. Primitive erythroblasts contain these embryonic hemoglobins. So there are 3 embryonic hemoglobins: Gower 1, Gower 2, and Portland. Gower 1 contains 2 zeta chains and 2 epsilon chains. Gower 2 contains 2 alpha and 2 epsilon chains. Portland contains 2 zeta and 2 gamma chains. So para daw mas dali nimo siya matiman i-arrange nimo siya in this manner. Gower 1, Gower 2, and Portland. Then ZAS, zeta, alpha, zeta, ZAS, and EEG, epsilon, epsilon, gamma. So Gower 1, 2, 3, Portland, ZAS, and EEG. So very dumb, but I hope it helps. I do hope it helps. So that's it for our mesoblastic period. Ang iyahang end product is the primitive erythroblast, and it happens in the blood islands of the yolk sac. It is an intravascular and extra-embryonic hematopoiesis. And it is not a definitive hematopoiesis because ang primitive erythroblast kay lahi or very different from the erythrocytes na ato ang ginagamit or ginaproduce karon. The next period is the hepatic period. So, from here, the primitive erythroblast kay si yolk sac no mawala naman ni siya kadugayan as the embryo grows kay pareha di ba sa akong gi-mention ganina, si yolk sac kay mao na siya ang immediate source sa nutrients or support system ni embryo. So as the embryo grows, mawala man ang iyang support system kay ginakonsume man na niya. Therefore, mawala po itong mga primitive erythroblast na ginaproduce din hiya. And at the time of the hepatic period, ang katong mga hematopoietic stem cells nga naa sa aorta gonad mesonephros region kay maging active na. So therefore, the hepatic period is a definitive hematopoiesis because the type of blood cells produced in the hepatic period is the same blood cells that we are using, that we are producing today, now as adults. The hepatic period of hematopoiesis begins at the 4th to 5th week of gestation until 1 to 2 weeks after birth. So, hepatic period, in contrary to the mesoblastic period, is an extravascular and an intraembryonic hematopoiesis. The site of this hematopoiesis, very evident, no? Hepatic period. So, therefore, the prominent site of hematopoiesis in this period is the liver, and at the same time, other lymphoid organs like the spleen, kidney, and thymus. So, maolang yun ni siya ang best picture nga ako ang makita sa internet regarding the hepatic period of hematopoiesis. So, this is the cross-section of the liver under the microscope during the time of the hepatic hematopoiesis. So, the stage 1, so in the first stage sa hepatic hematopoiesis, wala pa kaayoy mga blood cells makita. Ang very evident lang is ang mga cells nga naay pink cytoplasm. So, mao ni sila nga to ang mga erythroblast nga naga-start na og migrate sa ato ang liver. So, in this picture, dili kayo na to ma-appreciate or makita no kung asa ang mga cells since it is very cellular and gamay and very gubot. So, daghan kayo og mga cells present na dili blood cells. That is because this happens in the liver. The liver itself as an organ nga dili naga-function for hematopoiesis is already very cellular. Dungagan pa sa fact nga at this time or in the hepatic phase of hematopoiesis na ay mga blood cells nga nag-infiltrate sa ato ang liver, making it more cellular and lisod kay sabton under the microscope. So, since this hurts our non-pathologist's eyes, let's proceed to the next picture. So, in this picture, makita na nato nga, klaro na siya. So, sa first stage sa hepatic phase of the hematopoiesis, mga erythroblasts kay nag-start na og migrate sa liver. Next, wala gipakita din pero naapaghihapon ni mga erythroblasts. At the same time nadugang ang kaning mga granulocytes. So, the granulocytes begins to appear or mga granulocyte precursors begins to appear or infiltrate the liver at the 7th week of gestation. Wala sa gipakita sa picture no, but at the 6th week of gestation, ang mga megakaryocyte kay mag-start na pod og infiltrate sa liver. So what are these megakaryocytes? So megakaryocyte kay mao ni sila ang cells na tinubdan or mao ni sila ang mga cells wherein the platelets originated from. Now at the third stage of the hepatic phase of hematopoiesis or the hepatic period of hematopoiesis, pansinin nyo na mas nagadaghan na ang mga blood cells nga naga-infiltrate sa ato ang liver. At the same time, in this stage or in the third stage, specifically in the 8th to 9th week of gestation, the platelets will be released into the circulation. So, unsa gani ni sila mga platelets? So, si platelets kay mao ni ang cytoplasmic projection ni megakaryocyte. So, si megakaryocyte nga ning infiltrate sa liver atong 6th week will release its platelet at the 8th to 9th week of gestation. Aside from that, at the 11th week of gestation, the granulocytes will also be released or ang mga WBC will also be released into the circulation. And at the 4th stage of the hepatic phase of the hematopoiesis, yes, may hangganan ang lahat. So at the 4th stage or the last stage of the hepatic phase of hematopoiesis, nagsawa na ang mga blood cells sa liver and nagsugod na sila og migrate to the bone marrow. So nagsugod na sila og hawa. So nanggamay na ang mga blood cells nga naa sa liver. So pansin na no nga the hematopoiesis that happened is not within the blood vessels but instead the liver. So mao na siya nga ang hepatic period hematopoiesis is not an intravascular type of hematopoiesis. Aside from that, this hematopoiesis happened within the embryo, within the developing embryo itself. So therefore, intraembryonic siya nga hematopoiesis. So, one characteristics of the RBCs produced in the hepatic period is that it contains the hemoglobins F, A, and A2. So, unsa ang kalahian nila hemoglobins F, A, and A2 with those embryonic hemoglobins na present sa mesoblastic stage ganina? So, their difference is that chains ang present. So, hemoglobin F contains 2 alpha and 2 gamma. Hemoglobin A, on the other hand, contains 2 alpha and 2 beta. Hemoglobin A2 contains 2 alpha and 2 delta. So again, hemoglobin F contains 2 alpha and 2 gamma. Hemoglobin A contains 2 alpha and 2 beta. And hemoglobin A2 contains 2 alpha and 2 delta. So, katong nga mga hemoglobins na gi-mention, si F, A, and A2, Mo po ni nga hemoglobins ang present karon sa ato ang current na RBCs. In the hepatic period, though mas prominent si hemoglobin F. Hemoglobin F is also called as fetal hemoglobin because kani siya nga hemoglobin ang prominent sa ato ang fetal life. As we grow old, si hemoglobin A na ang maging prominent. So again, si hemoglobin F is only prominent during our fetal life. But as we grow old, inigawas na to especially, mag-increase na ang amount ni hemoglobin A until siya na ang maging dominant na hemoglobin. So during the hepatic period, the thymus is also responsible for the production of T cells. The kidneys and the spleen are also capable of producing B cells. The spleen is also developing, and at the 4th month of gestation, the spleen will be capable of lymphoid cell production. So kaya na niya makapaproduce og T or B cells or NK cells. And at the 2nd to 5th month of gestation, the spleen can undergo myelopoiesis or si spleen kay makaproduce na siya og mga granulocytes sila basophil, eosinophil, neutrophil, etc. And at the 5th month, the spleen is capable of monopoiesis kaya na ni spleen makaproduce og monocyte. Sa hepatic period, we have also mentioned kaganina that the megakaryocyte production will also begin. Diba? Na-mention man to kaganina na at the 6th week of gestation, kay si megakaryocyte moadto na sa cell or sa moadto na siya sa liver, mag-infiltrate na siya sa liver in order to produce platelets. At the last stage of the hepatic period, the hematopoietic stem cells carrying the cell marker CD34 will slowly begin to migrate to the bone marrow, thus marking the beginning of the medullary or myeloid period. So in the medullary or the myeloid period begins at the 5th month of gestation, peaks at the 6th month, and persists throughout life. So kita as adults are in the myeloid period of hematopoiesis. At the 21st week of gestation, the myeloid to erythroid ratio becomes 3:1. So what is this myeloid to erythroid ratio? Myeloid to erythroid. So myeloid to erythroid ratio is simply the expression of kung pila kadaghan ang myeloid precursor in contrast to the number of the erythroid precursor. So unsa ni mga myeloid precursor? So simply speaking, myeloid precursors kay katong mga precursors sa mga WBC. So dapat at the 21st week of gestation, ang mga precursors sa WBC is thrice compared sa mga precursors sa RBCs sa bone marrow. The medullary or the myeloid period happens in the bone marrow. And at this time, there is a measurable level of erythropoietin, granulocyte colony stimulation factor, and granulocyte monocyte colony stimulation factor. So, kani sila nga mga proteins mentioned, erythropoietin, GCSF, GMCSF, are proteins that stimulates the hematopoietic cells or the blood-forming cells in the bone marrow to produce a specific blood cell type. So, example, si erythropoietin will stimulate the erythrocyte progenitors to produce erythrocytes. So, this is the bone marrow. The specific area in the bone marrow where the hematopoiesis happens is in the hematopoietic cords. So, kani sila sa mga hematopoietic cords kanang murag area nga naga-bulge towards the sinus. Muna sila, dinha mahitabo ang hematopoiesis. From the beginning of the medullary phase up to birth and up to 4 years of life, all areas of the bone marrow are active. So, natay duha ka type sa bone marrow, si red bone marrow ug si yellow bone marrow. Si red bone marrow, mao ni siya ang hematopoietically active na bone marrow, meaning siya tong bone marrow nga naga-perform og hematopoiesis. or siya tong active na bone marrow. Bantog siya red kay of course dito man mahitabo ang blood cell formation. Meanwhile, si yellow bone marrow is the not active or the inactive bone marrow. So si yellow bone marrow, instead of having hematopoietic cells inside it, it contains adipocytes or mga fat cells. Now, from the beginning of the medullary phase up to birth and up to the 4 years of life, tanang bone marrow kay red. But after the 4th year of life, magsugod na og transform ang ubang bone marrow, ang ubang red bone marrow into yellow bone marrow. So that process is termed as retrogression. Retrogression. So retrogression refers to the transformation of some red marrow to become yellow marrow. So when we say retrogression, it just refers to the process wherein the active bone marrow will become inactive and replaced by fats or adipocytes. So here is the summary of the hematopoietic developmental period. So sa sugod no katong embryo pa ta, that hematopoietic period is termed as mesoblastic period. So in the mesoblastic period, again, primitive erythroblast pa lang ang maproduce, dili pa siya definitive hematopoiesis kay ang primitive erythroblast mawala lang man gihapon siya kadugayan and dili siya mag-persist throughout life. In the next phase, so mawala na to ang mga mesenchymal cells na precursor ni primitive erythroblast ang mag-arise kay ang katong mga hematopoietic stem cells na gikan sa aorta gonad mesonephros. So katong nga mga hematopoietic stem cell will go to the liver, thus marking the beginning of the hepatic period. Sa last stage sa hepatic period, kay mag-transfer ang mga hematopoietic stem cell to the bone marrow. And so, dito na sila always sa bone marrow during normal circumstances. However, naay mga sakit na makapapugos sa liver ug sa spleen nga mag-perform og hematopoiesis. So, kato sila na mga sakit. We'll just discover that as we go along our course. As what you can observe in the graph, the bone marrow of the vertebra is the most cellular. So, ang bone marrow sa vertebra is the most hematopoietically active. At the same time, si sternum pod, somehow active pod siya, the ribs pod, femur, and the tibia. As we grow older, kanina lang sila na mga bones ang naay remaining na active bone marrow. So, as what we can observe here, ang kaning mga red areas, mauna lang na siya ang mga bones nga naay active bone marrow or meaning naay red bone marrow. That is the skull, proximal end of long bones, the sternum, the vertebrae, and the iliac crest. So the preferred site for bone marrow aspiration in adults is the iliac crest, and for babies is the sternum. What is in the bone marrow that makes it very suitable for hematopoiesis? Well, the hematopoietic microenvironment of the bone marrow is very ideal for the hematopoietic stem cells for it to do its work. Unsa din na sa environment sa bone marrow? The extracellular matrix of the bone marrow is a semi-fluid material containing proteins and carbohydrates, and the combination of both, or the proteoglycans. So, the extracellular matrix allows the bone marrow, or allows the hematopoietic cells to be anchored into the bone marrow. So, dili lang ang richness sa extracellular matrix with proteoglycans ang nagapahimo sa bone marrow na ideal for hematopoiesis. It also has the stromal cells or the supporting cells. So, kani sila na mga cells also play a role in nurturing the hematopoietic cells and the hematopoietic stem cells. So, let's begin with the endothelial cells. So, si endothelial cells, siya ang nag-serve as a lining. The endothelial cells line the hematopoietic cords or ang area kung asa mahitabo ang hematopoiesis. So, endothelial cells as a lining regulates the flow of the particles entering the hematopoietic cords. So, siya ang Mura siya og plasma membrane good na selective lang ang iyahang ginapasulod sa hematopoietic cords katulang mga useful substances ang iyahang ginapasulod didto and at the same time it barriers or it stops mga non-necessary materials from entering the bone marrow. Next is the adipocytes. So adipocytes or the fat cells secrete steroids or mga fat hormones that influence hematopoiesis. At the same time, adipocytes also contribute to the integrity of the bone itself. So if ligon ang bone, happy si bone marrow kay ligon man ang iyahang environment. Next is the macrophage. So si macrophage no is a known phagocytic cell. So si macrophage as a phagocytic cell resides in the bone marrow to phagocytose or to eat dangerous elements, dangerous cells na masaag sa bone marrow. So, si macrophage, if naay masaag na bacteria, i-engulf niya ang bacteria. At the same time, macrophage will also produce cytokines. So, what are cytokines? So, cytokines, ma-encounter yun ninyo ang daghan ani nila sa immune, no? Ma-encounter po nato ni ang cytokines karon as we go along our lecture. So, cytokines, in simpler terms, are proteins that influence cells to do something. So, si macrophage produce cytokines. By the way, di lang si macrophage ang nag-produce og cytokines. Si endothelial cells, adipocytes, and wala na butang dinhi si reticular cells also produce cytokines that help in regulating the hematopoiesis. So, that is the function of macrophage in the bone marrow or in the hematopoietic cord. It acts as a phagocyte and it releases cytokines. Now, these two cells, si osteoblast and si osteoclast, these two cells work hand in hand to maintain the bone integrity. So you have learned from your anaphysiol, no, from your histology that osteoblast is the bone-forming cell, whereas osteoclast is the bone-resorbing cell. So si osteoclast siya to ang nag-build sa bone, si osteoclast ang naga-destroy or dili man naga-destroy but naga-kut-kut sa specific area sa bone to maintain its integrity or its form. Now, the last cell, wala na appeal sa PPT, pero nasulat ganina, si reticular cells. Reticular cells produce reticulin fibers. So, these fibers na ginaproduce ni reticulin help support the hematopoietic cells. So, sila ang naga-anchor, or kaninga fibers ang naga-anchor sa mga hematopoietic cells in their area or in their specified position sa hematopoietic cord. So, these stromal or supporting cells together with the extracellular matrix will interact with each other to help the hematopoietic system or the hematopoietic cells do its function in producing the different types of blood cells. At this point of our discussion, we will talk about the different adult hematopoietic tissue. So we will discuss the different hematopoietic organs or the organs involved in hematopoiesis, whether directly or indirectly. We will also talk about the different diseases involving these organs that may affect hematopoiesis. First off, the bone marrow. So, na-mention na to kanina no, na bone marrow is the major site of adult hematopoiesis. We have also stated some reasons kung ano siya ang perfect site for hematopoiesis. So, there are bone marrow disorders that can affect its capacity to produce blood. First is the bone marrow malignancy, or in simpler terms is the cancer of the bone marrow. So for examples of these are leukemia or cancer sa white blood cells, and many others, mga cancer sa different hematopoietic cells. Another type of disease na maka-affect sa hematopoietic capacity sa bone marrow is cancer metastasis. So, examples of this are kanang mga cancer nga nag-metastasize or nag-adto sa inyohang or nagkalat sa inyohang bone marrow. Just like in breast cancer nga nag-metastasize sa bone marrow, pancreatic cancer nga nag-metastasize sa bone marrow. So, how does cancer metastasis affect the bone marrow's capacity to produce blood? Pag mag-metastasize man good ang mga cancer cells or mga neoplastic cells, magguot na ang bone marrow. And neoplastic cells are territorial. Kung naadto na sila sa bone marrow, i-occupy gyud na nila ang area dito since they are they have high proliferative index or meaning paspas managhan ang mga cancer cells, ma-outnumber niya ang mga hematopoietic stem cells. So pag ma-outnumber na ang mga hematopoietic stem cells, gamay na lang ang hematopoietic stem cells, therefore gamay na lang pod ang blood cell production. So in times like this, mag-resort ang body to extramedullary hematopoiesis. What is this extramedullary hematopoiesis? So, in simpler terms, hematopoiesis na outside sa bone marrow. Since wala na may space ang hematopoietic stem cell sa bone marrow, mag-transfer sila dito sa liver or sa spleen para dito na mahitabo ang hematopoiesis. And is that enough to compensate? Well, depende on the body. But in most cases, dili gihapon jud enough ang extramedullary hematopoiesis kay lahi lang jud ang bone marrow environment compared sa spleen ug sa liver. The next organ, speaking of the liver. The liver is the primary organ for protein synthesis. And daghan jud kaayo og mga proteins na gina-synthesize si liver, no, and few of those proteins are directly involved in hematopoiesis. Example of that protein is the thrombopoietin. So, si liver ang main producer sa thrombopoietin. Thrombopoietin will act on the megakaryocyte progenitors to produce more megakaryocyte, thereby producing more platelets. So, example lang na siya sa effect ni liver sa hematopoiesis because of its protein synthesis function. The next function of liver, which is indirectly involved in hematopoiesis, is the bilirubin conjugation. So, unsa gani si bilirubin? Bilirubin is the breakdown product of heme. You have learned from previous discussions na si RBC, 120 days lang yun ang iyahang lifespan. And as RBC dies, si hemoglobin is a breakdown. Now, si bilirubin is the product of the breakdown of heme portion of the hemoglobin. Bilirubin should be conjugated in order for it to be properly excreted. So, bilirubin conjugation is the function of the liver. Next function of the liver is that it transports bilirubin to the small intestine for excretion. So, the different diseases affecting the liver that will also affect the hematopoiesis is porphyria, hemolytic anemia, and the storage diseases. So, this is the liver. These are the sinusoids. And in here, or in these passages, sinusoids are passages, by the way. So, in here, in the sinusoids, the bilirubin or the conjugated bilirubin will be secreted. So, let's talk about bilirubin and bilirubin conjugation muna. So, once an RBC dies, or if it already reached its 120 days, the splenic macrophages or katong mga macrophage nga naa sa spleen will engulf the RBC or phagocytize the RBC. Now, the RBC will be degraded, then the hemoglobin inside the RBC will be released and will be broken down into its heme and globin parts. So, si globin kay mao ni siya ang part sa heme na made up of mga protein chains. So, remember sa hemoglobin, example, hemoglobin A, di ba na siya 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. So, katong mga chains dito kay mao to siya ang globin portion sa hemoglobin. So, those chains or the globin portion will be recycled since need man sa body ang mga amino acids na present in those globin chains. Meanwhile, si heme, ang iron component ni heme will be ma-meet niya ning 3 fates. It could be released to transferrin, it could be stored, or it could be added to some proteins. Pero ang porphyrin portion ni heme will become unconjugated bilirubin. So how? Heme, by the action of heme oxygenase, will be converted to biliverdin. So after biliverdin, by the action of biliverdin reductase, will become unconjugated bilirubin. So si unconjugated bilirubin, mao ni siya ang gina-release sa mga splenic macrophage or ginagawa sa mga splenic macrophage, then as unconjugated bilirubin is released to the bloodstream, i-bind siya ni albumin for it to be transported into the liver. The binding of albumin to unconjugated bilirubin is done because unconjugated bilirubin in its normal form is not water soluble. So if ang substance is not water soluble, dili siya pwede i-add to sa plasma. So bantog siya gina-bind ni albumin for it to become somehow water soluble and for it to travel through the plasma. So as it travels through the plasma, it will go to the liver. So inig-abot ni unconjugated bilirubin dito sa liver, i-conjugate na siya. So bilirubin conjugation is done in order for the bilirubin to be water soluble and metabolizable. So how is it being conjugated? Adan lang siya og glucuronate. Glucuronate or glucuronic acid, they are the same, no? They are being added to our unconjugated bilirubin for the unconjugated bilirubin to become conjugated. That is done through the enzyme UDGPT. So UDGPT, ma-mention man yapon ninyo ni siya sa chem, no? In summary na lang, UDGPT is a transferase. Therefore, it transfers the glucuronate to the unconjugated bilirubin for it to become conjugated. And once conjugated, the bilirubin will either recirculate or it might be excreted in the feces. One of the diseases involving the liver and the hematopoiesis is the porphyria. Porphyria is a group of diseases caused by the enzyme deficiency of the enzymes needed in hemoglobin synthesis. So, to give you a general idea, no, what is porphyria, let's have this diagram. So, si succinyl coenzyme A and glycine, mao gid ni sila ang base substances for us to create the heme, atong heme portion sa ato ang hemoglobin. So, in porphyria, si succinyl coenzyme A plus glycine, kay mag-undergo na siya or ma-process na siya through different enzymes. So, through these different enzymes, si succinyl coenzyme A and glycine will become porphyrins. So, daghan na sila nga klase nga porphyrins, no? Daghan na sila klase na porphyrins and at the same time, daghan pug enzymes involved in those porphyrins. So, si porphyrins, with the help of another enzyme, will become protoporphyrin. Si protoporphyrin plus the iron na gikan sa ato ang kinaon ba or na-recycle na iron from previous RBCs will become heme. So, ang addition ni iron sa protoporphyrin is also mediated by an enzyme. So, protoporphyrin plus iron will become heme. So, in porphyria, enzymes are deficient. So, ang mga enzymes nga nag-help sa porphyrins na ma-convert into protoporphyrin or ang mga enzymes nga nag-help sa mga porphyrins na ma-convert to another form of porphyrins are deficient. So, with that, since wala man tong mga enzyme na maka-convert sa porphyrins, mag-accumulate ang porphyrins. Si porphyrins, daghan ni sila klase na mga porphyrins, no? Is dangerous once mag-accumulate sa mga liver cells or sa any cells sa body. Aside from that, since wala man ang mga enzymes na mag-convert from porphyrin to protoporphyrin, therefore, wala po'y mahimo nga heme. So, if wala'y mahimo nga heme, it is then safe to conclude na baba pod ang level sa hemoglobin. So, in porphyria, then, napod time, it is also expected na maka-experience ta og anemia ug baba nga rate sa erythropoiesis since baba man ang hemoglobin sa body. One of the common symptoms or signs and symptoms na present sa mga patients having porphyria, regardless of the type of porphyria, is light sensitivity. That is because most porphyrins are light sensitive. So, since light sensitive man ang substance nga nag-accumulate sa imuhang mga body cells, like for example, in this case, the skin, sensitive po ang imuhang skin to light since mag-react man ang porphyrins nga nag-accumulate din haa. The next disease that we will discuss involving the liver and hematopoiesis is the hemolytic anemia. So, hemolytic anemia refers to the destruction of RBCs. So, in the body, RBCs can be destroyed intravascularly or extravascularly. So, sa intravascular hemolysis, intra meaning within, vascular, the blood vessel. So, intravascular hemolysis happens within the blood vessels, whereas extravascular hemolysis happens outside the blood vessels, particularly in this organ, the spleen. So, there are various causes for hemolytic anemias. It could be autoimmune, or it could be due to the improper RBC morphology itself. So, for now, dili sa nato i-discuss ang mga causes sa hemolytic anemia. For now, we will just note that in hemolytic anemia, RBC destruction is rapid. Maskin og dili pa time sa RBC na mamatay, maskin og wala pa siya nakaabot og 120 days, ma-destroy na siya. And once that happens, increased ang RBC destruction, meaning daghan pod og hemoglobin nga ma-release, therefore daghan pod og hemoglobin nga ma-breakdown, and thus daghan og bilirubin nga ma-produce. So the increase in bilirubin will lead to what we call as jaundice. So jaundice kay mao na siya no, magyellow ang panit, magyellow ang mata. That is due to the increased bilirubin. Now, aside from the increased hemoglobin in hemolytic anemia, it is also important to know that the response of the bone marrow will be to produce more red blood cells. Kay of course, napansin man ni bone marrow nga gina-destroy ang mga RBC, so ang response niya kay padaghanan pa gyud niya ang production sa RBC to compensate for the loss. So in hemolytic anemia nga in patients with hemolytic anemia nga normal ang ilahang bone marrow, it is expected na increased ang hematopoiesis, specifically the erythropoiesis or the production of RBCs. The next disease is the storage diseases. So there are many storage diseases good, and the examples that I will give you are the Gaucher disease, I don't know how to pronounce that, or the Niemann-Pick disease. So storage diseases are due to the lack of the enzymes needed for the breaking down of a specific substance. So example na is in Gaucher disease. So the enzyme that is lacking is the glucocerebrosidase. So glucocerebrosidase breaks down glucocerebroside. Now if wala si glucocerebrosidase, increased ang levels ni glucocerebroside and it has higher tendency to accumulate in various organs. And isa sa mga organs na commonly gina-accumulatean sa mga glucocerebroside o sa mga other substances pa jud is the liver. Now, once substances are accumulated, unwanted substances are accumulated in the liver will malfunction. So, ansa ganito ang primary function ni liver? Protein synthesis. Therefore, protein synthesis is affected, and many proteins will be decreased in production. The next organ that we will talk about is the spleen. So how does the spleen function in hematopoiesis? The spleen is known as the largest secondary lymphoid organ. Now, as a lymphoid organ, diba you have learned from immuno that in secondary lymphoid organs happens the antibody production. Therefore, si spleen as the largest secondary lymphoid organ is the site for the largest antibody production. So, spleen is defined by Rodax as an organ that is vital but not essential for life. Maybe that is because pwede nimo tanggalon si spleen na ay mga tao nga wala na spleen and walay sa ba? Wala siya fatal effect sa imo ha. However, it is vital kay tungod ato nga fact na important siya sa immunity because it is the site of antibody production. So therefore, pag mawalaan kag spleen, walay fatal thing na mahitabo sa imo ha. However, ma-immunodeficient ka. The second function of spleen is that in this organ happens the RBC removal. So, let's look at the spleen. So, mao nga to ang spleen, no? It is composed of two pulps, namely white pulp, white pero black ang color. I think para lang yun na siya makita ang area. So, this is the white pulp. So, in the white pulp happens the antibody production. So, in the white pulp, dinhi mag-encounter ni B cell or sa mga lymphocytes ang antigen. So, with that, katunay antibody production nga mahitabo. This is the red pulp. So, in the red pulp happens the RBC removal. So, si spleen is very, meticulous na siya, no? Any pangit na part sa ato ang RBC kay ginatanggal na niya. So, if naay mga inclusions or naay unwanted material nga ning sulod sa ato ang RBC, ginatanggal na siya ni spleen by the process termed as pitting. So, pitting, letter P, stands for removal of the letter P for pangit na mga parts sa RBC. And the spleen also removes the senescent or katong mga tigulang na nga RBC through the process termed as culling. Wala akong isulat. Pitting, itong removal sa pangit na part sa RBC. And culling, katong removal sa mga old or senescent RBCs or RBCs nga naglampas og 120 days through phagocytosis. So in this red pulp, naanay mga macrophage din nga mag-engulf sa mga old RBCs. Those macrophages are termed as splenic macrophage. So, notice the sinus present in the red pulp. So, mga sinus katong passageway man ni sila, no? So, in this sinus, dinhi nagaagi ang mga RBCs. Now, the splenic sinuses are very small and that size of the splenic sinus is not ideal or is not friendly for RBCs. Aside from the fact that ang agianan or ang sinus is small, the environment of the red pulp of the spleen is also promoting an environment that is hypoglycemic, acidic, and hypoxic. So, if the environment na agian sa RBC no kay kadto acidic, hypoglycemic meaning gamay ang source, gamay ang glucose, so therefore gamay pod ang possible source sa energy, and hypoxic meaning gamay ang oxygen concentration. So, kato nga mga conditions nga present sa environment sa ato ang red pulp sa spleen makes it very harsh for the RBCs. So, RBCs na very fragile will lyse-gude as it passes through the red pulp of the spleen. One of the grave events that can happen in our spleen is autosplenectomy. And autosplenectomy is only possible in patients with sickle cell anemia. So, in most cases or in severe cases of sickle cell anemia, most or majority of the RBCs are sickle-shaped. So, these sickle-shaped RBCs become sickle-shaped once they are deoxygenated. So, once matransport na ni RBC ang oxygen dito sa tissue, mahimo siyang sickle cell. And these sickle cell RBCs are very rigid and they are not soluble and they have high tendencies to clog in areas na mga guot or in passages na mga guot. So, di ba remember that the splenic sinuses are very tiny. So, imagine if those cells, mga sickle cells, kay mubara din hiya, So once the sickle cells will clog up in here, ma-impede or mahinder ang blood supply towards the spleen. And any organ nga mahutdan og blood supply will of course die or magmalfunction. So that will also happen to the spleen once mabara na siya. And then, once the spleen malfunctions or once the spleen is rendered useless because of the prolonged lack of blood supply, that will lead to the individual's susceptibility to infections because the largest secondary lymphoid organ or the largest site for antibody production is malfunctioning. So if the malfunctioning of the spleen presents a problem, so as the hyperactivity of the spleen. So in conditions like liver cirrhosis or portal hypertension, so portal hypertension kanang increased ang blood pressure sa hepatic portal vein, katong vein nga naga-supply og blood sa imuhang artery. So in those conditions, liver cirrhosis and hepatic or portal hypertension, hypersplenism may occur. So what is hypersplenism? That is simply the hyperactivity of the spleen. So why is this a problem? Well, we all know, or if you will read Rodax, it defines the spleen as the indiscriminate filter of blood cells. So si spleen, gina-filter niya ang mga blood cells nga mag-agi sa iyahan. So gamayng pangit lang na part ni blood cell, kay tanggalon na dayon na niya sa circulation. So in hypersplenism, maging hyperactive si spleen, usahay magpataka na lang na siya og filter or tanggal sa mga blood cells. And that leads to pancytopenia. What is pancytopenia? So pan meaning all, cyto cells, and penia meaning decreased. So pancytopenia meaning mag-decrease ang level sa tanan nimong blood cells. That is because naging hyperactive na si spleen, so nagpataka na lang siya og filter, nagpataka na lang siya og tanggal sa mga blood cells na moagi sa iya ha. So the next hematopoiesis related organ is the lymph nodes. So what are the functions of the lymph nodes? The lymph nodes play a role in the formation of new lymphocytes, particularly the B lymphocytes. The lymph nodes, as a secondary lymphoid organ, also play a role or is also the site for antibody production. And ang pinakakilalang function ni lymph node is it filters particulate matter. In fact, the lymph node is dubbed as the dump site of the body. Kay dinhi daw sa lymph node ginapanglabay ang tanan nga mga debris or pathogen nga naa sa body. So how does the lymph node handle that? Sa lymph nodes kay daghan og mga macrophages and mga lymphocytes nga naga-produce og antibody to help destroy those pathogens nga na-deposit sa iyaha. And of course, daghan og macrophage para ma-phagocytize to niya ang mga pathogens nga present sa iyaha. However, if ma-overwhelm na si lymph nodes with pathogens, kung daghan na gyud kaayo ang mga pathogens, it might lead to adenitis or the inflammation of the lymph nodes. So, in adenitis, dili na kaya sa mga macrophages, sa mga lymphocytes, sa mga defense mechanism sa lymph node na i-handle ang mga pathogens. The other problem na ma-encounter ni lymph nodes are the metastasis or cancer metastasis. So, si lymph node ang isa sa mga common site na ginaadtuan sa mga neoplastic cells in metastasis. So, diba in metastasis, mao ni siya ang katong pagkalat sa cancer sa isa ka specific area to the other area. So, isa sa mga common sites na ilahang ginaadtuan for metastasis is the lymph nodes. So, this is the lymph node. So, in the germinal center of the lymph node happens the production of B lymphocytes or happens the multiplication of the B lymphocyte. So, maunang iyahang contribution to hematopoiesis. Si lymph node ang nagapadaghan sa number sa B lymphocytes. Next is the thymus. The thymus is both a primary lymphoid organ and an endocrine gland. So, as a primary lymphoid organ, the thymus helps in the production or helps in the training of the T cells. And as an endocrine gland, it produces hormones such as thymopoietin and thymolin, which helps in the differentiation of the T cells. It also produces thymosin, which helps in the promotion of the production of the growth hormone. Now, thymus is an organ that normally undergoes atrophy at the age or at the time of puberty. So, maskin og mag-atrophy na si thymus, no, maskin og dili na kayo siya functional at that, maskin og mag-shrink na siya nga organ at the time of puberty, its effect in training the cell lymphocytes to fight off infection and cancer will last a lifetime. So, in anak ka-efficient na teacher si thymus, kay maskin og mag-atrophy na siya at puberty, ang mga training or ang mga selection nga iyahang gihimo sa ato ang T cells is enough for the T cells to remember how to fight infections and how to fight cancer. So this is our thymus. Dinhi ang cortex, no, dinhi mahitabo tong positive selection. And this is the medulla wherein the negative selection happens. So the positive and the negative selection, as you have learned in your immuno, is done to prevent autoimmunity. So this is done para dili maging reactive si T cells, si T lymphocyte sa self-antigens. There are cases wherein the thymus is not developed, and the non-development of the thymus is very fatal for children because that will render the children immunodeficient for the rest of his life. Kay ang iyahang T cells wala man na train to fight infections. However, thymic disturbances or mga problems sa thymus in adults is does not produce a great effect as that of the non-development of the thymus in infants. That is because since expected naman po jud na nag-atrophy ang thymus at the onset of puberty, so ang mga disturbances or problems sa thymus na mag-arise at that age is not that fatal. Let us now proceed to the different stem cell theories. So far there are two types of stem cell theories: the monophyletic theory, also known as the Unitarian theory, and the polyphyletic theory, also known as dualistic theory. So monophyletic theory states that there is only one parent stem cell, termed as the hemocytoblast, which is capable of giving rise to all types of blood cell. So si hemocytoblast lang gyud daw ang origin sa all types of blood cells. However, the polyphyletic theory or the dualistic theory states that blood cells arise from several precursors, which are the myeloid and the lymphoid parent cell. So the polyphyletic theory tells us that each type of blood cell has its own unique stem cell. So for example, si lymphocyte, na daw siya iyahang own unique stem cell, which is the lymphoid stem cell. The widely accepted theory is the monophyletic theory, which states that all blood cells arise from a single hematopoietic stem cell, termed as the hemocytoblast. That ends our discussion for the first part of the hematopoiesis.